This May, 5 men were put to death across the US, and each case was darker, more twisted, and more tragic than the last. Let me take you inside their last moments. Jeffrey Hutchinson, Florida, May 1st, 2025. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was sentenced to death for the 1998 murders of his girlfriend and her 3 children in Crestview, Florida. A former Army Ranger and Gulf veteran, Hutchinson struggled with his mental health after returning from combat. His first marriage ended in divorce, and the second relationship with Renee Flaherty eventually turned fatal. On September 11, 1998, after an argument with Renee, Hutchinson left their home, went to a bar, and told the bartender he was angry. Less than an hour later, he returned with a shotgun and fatally shot Renee, 32, and her 3 children, Geoffrey, 9, Amanda, 7, and Logan, 4, in their home. All victims were shot in the head. Geoffrey was also shot in the chest. Hutchinson called the police right away and he was arrested at the scene. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. At trial, he claimed that masked intruders committed the killings, then later said it was a crime of passion committed under the influence of alcohol. The jury didn't buy any defense. On January 18, 2001, Hutchinson was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison for Renee's murder and death for the killings of the children, citing their young age and the brutal nature of the crime, especially Geoffrey's, whom Hutchinson shot twice. Despite appeals citing mental illness and military trauma, his convictions and sentences were upheld. The Florida Supreme Court ruled the domestic nature and lack of prior violence didn't outweigh the severity of the crimes. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant of Jeff Hutchinson on April 1st, 2025. The Flaherty family murders were among the most devastating in Okaloosa County's history. In the aftermath, grief counselors were sent to the children's school to support the community. Hutchinson was executed shortly after 8 p.m. on Thursday at Florida State Prison in Rayford, using the state's standard 3-drug trial injection protocol: etomidate, rocuronium bromide, and potassium acetate. He was pronounced dead at 8:14 p.m., according to the Florida Department of Corrections. This was Florida's 4th execution of the year and the 15th in the U.S. in 2025. Hutchinson declined to give a final statement and reportedly mumbled to himself as the execution began, according to the Associated Press. His last meal consisted of salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, baked potato, and iced tea. Hutchinson's family fought till the very end to save his life and postpone the execution. There was some evidence that he may not have committed the murders, and he actually maintained his innocence all these years. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence in this case was the fact that he had blood spatter under his shoes, something that couldn't have happened if he was the shooter. Another thing that his loved ones tried to explain was that Hutchinson was not actually the one that called 911, but it was in fact the real murderer who was trying to frame Hutchinson. They said that the reason he was put into this situation was that some people were trying to involve him in robberies because he had military expertise and he refused to help them. I will admit that this was one case in which I did have doubts about his innocence. I know that there are many things pointing out that he was the killer, but at the same time, there may be some details that were not properly investigated. I'm not saying he was innocent, but I do wish that things were crystal clear. A lot of you guys will say that the justice system in the US is based on proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and I know that's how it works. I support the death penalty, but my personal belief is that nobody should be executed without knowing 110% that there is no possibility whatsoever of punishing the wrong person. Glenn Rogers, Florida, May 15, 2025. Nicknamed the cross-country killer and the Casanova killer, Glenn Rogers was convicted of first-degree murder in 2 separate trials for the killings of 2 women, one in Florida in 1997 and another in California in 1999. He was also suspected in several other homicides across the U.S. His killing spree began on September 28, 1995, and after his first confirmed murder, he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Rogers received death sentences both in Florida and in California. After spending nearly 30 years on death row, he was finally executed on May 15, 2025. Rogers was born in Hamilton, Ohio, one of 7 children of Edna and Claude Rogers, a hydropulp operator at the local Champion paper mill. His brother Clay is among his surviving siblings. Glenn was expelled from junior high school before turning 16. Following his expulsion, Rogers impregnated his 14-year-old girlfriend, Deborah Ann Nix, and they got married. The couple had a second child in 1981. Nix, however, filed for divorce in 1983, citing physical abuse. Authorities in Hamilton, Ohio, suspected Rogers of the 1993 murder of an elderly man, after which he left the state and reappeared in California. In 1995, he was linked to the killings of 4 women across California, Mississippi, Florida, and Louisiana. Rogers was arrested in Kentucky on November 13, 1995. Initially, he claimed responsibility for nearly 70 murders, but later retracted the statement, saying he was just joking and had not killed anyone. Let's talk about the victims. Mark Peters, Hamilton, Ohio. On January 10, 1994, the remains of 71-year-old Mark Peters, a retired electrician and veteran, were found in a family-owned cabin in Kentucky. Peters had taken Rogers in before he went missing in October 1993. Rogers vanished around the same time. Peters' body was found tied to a chair and concealed under furniture. Police were led to the scene by Rogers' brother Clay. Sandra Gallagher, Los Angeles, California. On September 28, 1995, Rogers was seen with 33-year-old Sandra Gallagher at a bar in Van Nuys. The next day, her strangled and burned body was found in her truck near Rogers' apartment. He fled afterwards and was suspected of additional murders in other states. He was convicted of her murder in June 1999 and sentenced to death in California. Linda Price, Jackson, Mississippi. Linda Price met Rogers at the Mississippi State Fair in fall 1995. They briefly lived together. The 34-year-old single mother vanished just before Halloween, and her body was later found in her bathtub. She shared traits with Rogers' other suspected victims, including red hair and being in her 30s. Guys, it started raining and there's a lot of thunder going on, so if you're hearing those noises, I'm sorry. Tina Marie Cribbs, Tampa, Florida. On November 5, 1995, Cribbs was last seen leaving a bar with Rogers. Her body was found 2 days later in a motel bathtub, having been stabbed multiple times. Fingerprints and evidence linked Rogers to the crime. He was arrested on November 13 while driving her car. Rogers claimed she had lent him the vehicle. In July 1997, he was convicted of her murder in Florida and sentenced to death. Andy Giles Sutton, Bossier City, Louisiana. A known acquaintance of Rogers, Sutton was found dead in her apartment on a punctured waterbed. Rogers fled the state, leading police on a 13-mile chase in Kentucky before being captured. His arrest was caught on film by a local TV crew. After being sentenced to death for Cribbs' murder, Rogers' scheduled 1999 execution was delayed due to multiple appeals, all of which were ultimately denied. He challenged the conviction on several grounds, including prosecutorial misconduct and improper testimony. His final appeal was denied in 2011. On April 15, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Rogers' death warrant, setting the execution for May 15. Rogers was the 5th Florida inmate scheduled for execution this year. He attempted to stop the execution by citing childhood essay and concerns about the drugs used in the lethal injection, but the Florida Supreme Court denied the appeal on May 9. The U.S. Supreme Court also rejected the final appeal on May 14. Rogers, 62 years old, was executed according to plan at Florida State Prison, and he was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. His final meal was pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. He was the 16th person executed in the U.S. in 2025. In his final statement, Rogers addressed the victims' families and then President Donald Trump. I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you, in the near future, the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure. President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go. Matthew Johnson, Texas, May 20, 2025. On the morning of May 20, 2012, 76-year-old Nancy Judith Harris arrived early for her shift at the Final Whip convenience store in Garland, Texas. Harris, a beloved grandmother known for her kindness and routine, had no idea her workday would end in a brutal and senseless act of violence. Shortly after she began her shift, a man named Matthew Lee Johnson entered the store carrying a container of lighter fluid and a lighter, items he would soon use to commit an unthinkable crime. Surveillance footage from inside the store later revealed Johnson approaching Harris at the counter. Without warning, he began pouring lighter fluid all over her, demanding access to the cash register. Harris, trying to comply in hopes of avoiding escalation, she opened the register as instructed. Johnson then grabbed the contents, bills, coins, and even Harris's personal belongings, including her ring, 2 cigarette lighters, and cigarette packs. As Harris stood with her back to him, Johnson ignited the lighter fluid, setting her ablaze. As flames consumed her body, Harris ran to a nearby sink and desperately tried to extinguish the fire. She attempted to remove her burning shirt, leaned over the sink again, but was still engulfed in flames. Meanwhile, Johnson casually walked out of the store, taking candy from the counter as he exited. Outside, Harris managed to flee the building, screaming for help. A passerby who witnessed the horrifying scene rushed to her side with a fire extinguisher and attempted to put out the flames. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, finding Harris severely burned but conscious and able to provide a description of her attacker, a heavy-set black man with short hair and a round face. Law enforcement quickly canvassed the area and located witnesses who had seen a man matching Harris's description attempting to enter nearby homes. Approximately an hour later, officers apprehended Johnson after a short foot chase. He was found in possession of the stolen cash and items taken from the store. Initially charged with robbery and assault, his charges were upgraded to capital murder after Harris succumbed to her injuries 5 days later, on May 25, 2012, at Parkland Memorial Hospital's burn unit. Nancy Harris was a deeply loved member of her community. Her family described her as a warm and caring person, someone who spent her Fridays with her granddaughters in what they called Nini Days, which included trips to the dollar store, lunch at McDonald's, and games at home. She had previously overcome health scares and was regarded as a resilient and joyful woman who found immense pleasure in small, simple routines with her family. Matthew Lee Johnson, born on September 17, 1975 in Dallas County, had a long history of criminal behavior and personal instability. Raised in a difficult and reportedly abusive environment, he began engaging in criminal activity by age 15. His rap sheet included car theft, resisting arrest, and attacking police officers. Over the years, his offenses escalated, including a 2011 theft from an employer. Despite his criminal history, Johnson had periods of stability. He was married and had 3 daughters by the time of his arrest. However, his life remained marked by addiction and instability. Johnson stood trial for capital murder in Dallas County beginning on October 28, 2013. Prosecutors argued that Johnson deliberately and cruelly murdered Harris during the course of a robbery. They presented extensive evidence, including the store's surveillance footage, eyewitness testimonies, and physical evidence, such as the stolen items found in Johnson's possession. Prosecutors emphasized Johnson's calm demeanor after setting Harris on fire as a sign of his cold and calculated nature. During the punishment phase of the trial, his attorneys tried to argue for mercy. He took the stand and claimed that he was high on drugs at the time of the attack and that he never intended to actually harm Harris. He just wanted to scare her. He expressed remorse and said he would like to live to see his daughters grow up. The defense presented psychological and expert testimony highlighting Johnson's long history of drug addiction, which reportedly began during his adolescence. They also introduced evidence of childhood trauma, including SA, and testimonies from family members who detailed his struggles and attempts to overcome his addiction. The prosecution countered with evidence of Johnson's long criminal record and the brutality of the crime. They argued that Johnson posed a continuous threat to the society and that he deserved the harshest punishment possible. During victim impact statements, Harry's family addressed the court with raw emotion. Her children and grandchildren described the agony of losing her in such a violent way. One of her sons vowed to witness Johnson's execution, while another stated that he would never forgive Johnson, hoping the memory of Harris's screams would haunt him forever. Her granddaughters also expressed disbelief that Johnson felt any true remorse and emphasized the deep void left by Harris's absence. On October 30, 2013, the jury unanimously found Johnson guilty of capital murder. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 8, he was sentenced to death. Johnson reportedly showed no emotion as the verdict was read, and his attorney said that it was because Johnson expected this outcome. Over the next decade, Johnson pursued multiple appeals at the state and federal levels. Each was ultimately rejected. In November 2015, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction and sentence, rejecting 65 separate claims of error. In June 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case. Further efforts for relief were denied in 2019 by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. In 2022, they were also denied by the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas, and in 2023 by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. His final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied on February 20, 2024. By early 2025, Johnson had exhausted all possible legal remedies. In January, a Dallas County judge signed his death warrant, scheduling his execution for May 20, 2025, exactly 13 years to the day after he set Nancy Harris on fire. On May 16, just days before his execution, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied Johnson's request for clemency. His attorney confirmed that no further appeals would be made. On the day of his execution at the Huntsville unit, Johnson was given the opportunity to speak. In his final statement, he turned to Harris's family and said, "As I look at each one of you, I can see her on that day. I please ask you for forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her." He was executed by lethal injection and pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. Central Standard Time. Because he was executed in Texas, he did not get a final special meal. Benjamin Richie, Indiana, May 20, 2025. On September 29, 2000, Benjamin Donnie Richie fatally shot 31-year-old officer William Toney, a police officer in Beech Grove, Indiana. Richie was arrested shortly after and faced multiple charges, including the murder of a law enforcement officer. He was found guilty on August 10, 2002, and sentenced to death by a Marion County judge on October 15, 2002. Richie's legal team pursued numerous appeals, all of which failed. In his final efforts, he argued that his death sentence should be overturned due to severe mental health disorders and cognitive impairments. These, he claimed, were the result of childhood abuse, personal drug use, and his mother's substance abuse while pregnant with him. However, the Indiana Supreme Court ultimately denied his request to file a successive post-conviction relief petition. The court instead approved the state's request to set an execution date, which was carried out on May 20, 2025 at Indiana State Prison, where Richie had been incarcerated. Richie's life was fraught with adversity from the beginning. Born on May 3, 1980, he never knew his biological father. His mother, Marian Martin, worked as a stripper and struggled with addiction to drugs and alcohol, which continued during her pregnancy. By the time Richie turned 3, she had abandoned him twice. Her husband, Donald Peoples, took custody of Richie's older half-brothers, but left Benjamin behind upon learning he was not the boy's father. Initially named Benjamin Peoples, he was later adopted by Verna and Oscar Richie and took their surname. Richie's childhood and adolescence were marked by academic and behavioral difficulties. He repeated the first grade and left school in 9th grade. He began receiving counseling from a church minister as early as 3rd grade and was admitted for treatment at Community North Hospital by age 10. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder and other cognitive issues, Richie's struggles were attributed to his unstable upbringing and the lasting effects of prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol. In August 1998, he was convicted of burglary. By the time of the shooting in 2000, he was no longer in prison but under supervised probation. That September, he and 2 associates stole a white van from a Beech Grove gas station. About 2 hours later, Officer Matt Hickey identified the vehicle and began pursuit. He was joined by officers Robert Mercury and William Toney. During the chase, only Richie and 20-year-old Michael Greer remained in the stolen van. When the vehicle stopped in a residential yard, both fled on foot. Officer Hickey apprehended Greer while Officer Tony chased Richie. Richie drew a firearm and shot Officer Tony 4 times. One of the bullets pierced above the officer's bulletproof vest, fatally wounding him. Officer Tony had served on the police force for just 2 years. Richie was arrested the next day at the home of Michael Moody, the third participant in the theft. Prosecutor Scott Newman soon confirmed that the state would seek the death penalty. Due to media interviews where Richie claimed the shooting was accidental, a story supported by a friend, a gag order was imposed to prevent further public discussion before the trial. Initially, Michael Greer also faced murder charges. However, as part of a plea agreement, he pled guilty to lesser charges, including aiding a criminal, theft and trespassing, and agreed to testify against Richie. Greer faced a maximum sentence of 8 years. Moody was convicted of car theft and possessing an unlicensed firearm with a maximum 4-year sentence. Ahead of trial, Richie's attorneys filed a motion citing the 2002 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Ring v. Arizona, which held that only juries, not judges, can impose a death sentence. They argued Indiana's laws allowing judicial override were unconstitutional. Judge Patricia Gifford agreed in part, declaring judicial overrides unconstitutional, though she upheld the broader legality of the death penalty, allowing it to remain on the table. Richie's trial began on August 5, 2002, after jury selection at the end of July. The pretrial gag order expired when the proceedings started. On the trial's second day, Greer testified against Richie. The jury found Richie guilty of murder, car theft, carrying an unlicensed firearm, and resisting arrest. During the sentencing phase, Richie's defense highlighted his traumatic childhood and mental disabilities, arguing he deserved leniency. The prosecution rejected these arguments, asserting that many endure hardship without committing murder. After over 3 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Richie reportedly laughed upon hearing the verdict. On October 15, 2002, Judge Gifford formally sentenced 22-year-old Richie to death. Prior to the sentencing, Officer Tony's widow gave a victim impact statement, accusing Richie of cowardice and expressing hope that he would suffer in prison until his execution. Richie spent over 2 decades on Indiana death row. In 2014, he was among just 11 inmates awaiting execution. By 2020, the number had dropped to 8. And it's raining. Again. In 2024, it came to light that Richie had been in a 4-year relationship with a Swedish woman who first learned about him through a documentary. She even traveled to visit him in prison. They briefly discussed an escape plan which Richie called off to protect her. After their relationship ended, she struggled with substance abuse but eventually recovered and became a mother. Richie's legal battles persisted for years. The Indiana Supreme Court denied his first appeal in 2004 and his second in 2007. He alleged ineffective legal representation, which the court rejected. In 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed his final appeal. In September 2024, Indiana's Attorney General requested the court schedule Richie's execution. At the time, he was one of 4 death row inmates who had exhausted all appeals. He was also the only one convicted of killing a police officer, while 2 others awaited trial for similar crimes. Richie's attorneys submitted a final motion in response to the death warrant, claiming previous legal counsel had failed to explore potential fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or childhood lead exposure. While the court considered the arguments, Indiana resumed execution by putting Joseph Corcoran to death in December 2024, ending a 15-year hiatus caused by drug shortages. On April 15, 2025, the Indiana Supreme Court rejected Richie's final motion and scheduled his execution for before dawn on May 20, 2025. In the majority opinion, Justice Geoffrey Slaughter stated that the new evidence about cognitive issues wouldn't have changed the jury's decision. Chief Justice Loretta Rush dissented, arguing that the evidence warranted further review. 2 clemency hearings were scheduled on May 5th and May 12, 2025. During the first, Richie apologized for the murder, claiming he had changed and wanted to contribute positively if spared. At the second hearing, Officer Tony's family and friends urged the board to proceed with the execution. On May 14, both the parole board and Governor Mike Brown denied clemency. Richie also petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals for a delay. Both appeals were denied by May 19, the night before his execution. On May 20, 2025, at the age of 45, Benjamin Donnie Richie was executed by lethal injection at Indiana State Prison. The Indiana Department of Corrections reported that Benjamin Donnie Richie's execution began shortly after midnight. He was declared dead at 12:46 a.m. following the administration of a single dose of pentobarbital. For his final meal, he chose Olive Garden's tour of Italy, which features fettuccine alfredo, lasagna, and chicken parmigiana. His final words were, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." Information about the execution of the 45-year-old was limited, as media were not allowed to observe the procedure. Steve Schutt, Richie's defense attorney and one of the few witnesses, told the Indiana Capital Chronicle that Richie reacted sharply as the execution started. He jolted upward, lifting his shoulders and twitching violently for around 3 seconds. He didn't fall back down immediately. It seemed like he slowly settled back and then remained still for a few minutes before the curtains were drawn. Oscar Smith, Tennessee, May 22, 2025. Oscar Franklin Smith was sentenced to death in Tennessee for capital murder, and he was executed after years of delays. Originally set to be executed on April 21, 2022, his execution was temporarily halted by Governor Bill Lee due to issues with the lethal injection protocol. The murders occurred on October 1, 1989, when Smith's estranged wife, Judy Roberts Smith, and her sons, Chad and Jason Burnett, were killed in Nashville. Judy was shot in the neck and stabbed multiple times. Chad was shot in the eye, chest, and torso, and Jason was stabbed in the neck and abdomen. A sharp tool called an awl was found at the scene, but the murder weapons, a .22 caliber revolver and a knife, were never recovered. At the time, Smith and Judy were already separated, and Smith had taken out life insurance policies on all 3 victims. The couple had 3-year-old twins. Several co-workers testified that Smith had threatened Judy's life on numerous occasions and expressed resentment towards her sons, allegedly saying she favored them over the twins. During the attack, the family attempted to call 911, and Chad was reportedly heard screaming, "Frank, no." At trial, investigators claimed to have found a bloody palm print matching the 2 missing fingers Smith had. However, Smith later hired an expert who questioned the reliability of that evidence and pointed out errors in the original analysis. Smith was sentenced to death on July 26, 1990. His execution was initially planned for December 3, 1990 by electric chair, but legal appeals delayed it. Over the years, he became part of a broader legal challenge, arguing that lethal injection is cruel and causes extreme suffering. His execution dates in 2020 and 2021 were postponed due to the global context at the time. In 2022, Smith's legal team requested clemency from Governor Lee, seeking a sentence of life without parole. As he had been sentenced before 1999, Smith could choose his method of execution, either the electric chair or lethal injection. He declined to choose, so the state defaulted to lethal injection. In early 2022, Smith attempted to reopen his case based on new DNA evidence found on a weapon, but a Tennessee court denied his motion. Subsequent appeals to the Tennessee Supreme Court were also rejected. Governor Lee initially chose not to intervene, but later he issued a temporary reprieve upon discovering the state had not followed the correct procedures for testing the lethal injection drugs. Specifically, they had not been tested for endotoxins. This led to a suspension of all executions in Tennessee for the rest of that year and a third-party review of the process. By late 2024, the state had implemented a revised lethal injection protocol using pentobarbital. In March 2025, a new death warrant was signed for Smith, setting his execution for May 22 the same year. As he once again refused to choose a method, the state proceeded with lethal injection. Smith was executed as planned. He was pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m., and in his final statement, he maintained his innocence, saying, "Someone needs to tell the governor the justice system doesn't work. I didn't kill her." For his last meal, he requested hot dogs, tater tots, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. After the execution, Judy's siblings expressed ongoing grief and emphasized the lasting pain of domestic violence, a tragedy shared by many other families. Smith was the 19th person executed by the U.S. this year. For the month of June, 5 inmates have active death warrants. On June 10, Anthony Wainwright in Florida and Gregory Hunt in Alabama. Then on June 12, John Hanson in Oklahoma. The next day, June 13, Stephen Stanko in South Carolina. And on June 25, Richard Gerald Jordan in Mississippi. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.